Okay, good morning, everyone. I think welcome back. We'll get started on the second day of our discussions. But before we jump into that, let me make a couple of comments and also point out a few things. The first thing, one of the things that I neglected to mention yesterday, which I really wished I had raised, is that one of the unusual features of this forum is that we had the ability to commission a paper. And so there were two people from Harvard, Liana Woski and Elvis Garcia, who worked really very hard in the last few months to produce a paper which we asked them to summarize, looking back at some of the major events over the past several years, both the events and some of the conclusions and lessons learned from those events as a way to provide a broad overview for the discussions here. And so the paper is available. Is it passed out to everybody or it's not on? Okay, so the paper is outside on the table, so it's available to anybody, and I'd encourage you to both to pick it up and read it. I think it's quite informative to give you a kind of idea of how some of these discussions have transpired over the past decades. So yesterday, I think we had a fantastic set of discussions. We started with two broad overviews by Rick Bright and Arnold Monto, and I think that they both provided a perspective on, in essence, how have we done in the past, and in particular, Rick, for example, raised the issues of balancing the need for behavioral interventions and as well as technological innovation. And Arnold, of course, provided a very broad historical overview about some of the events which have transpired in the past. We had three panel discussions. And, panel one, which was led by Suri Moon, and which involved Abdullah Asiri, Masaka Fala, Gabriel Leung, and Amanda McClellan, got us off on the footing, and it focused attention, that discussion focused attentions on really the primacy of national capacities as the basis for being prepared. And, there are a lot of points made, and I'm not going to try to summarize them, but I just want to make a couple of observations. In looking at some of the events that they went through, Ebola, MERS, SARS, and where they represented Hong Kong and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Liberia, one of the key messages is that at the outset of all of these events, none of those places were ready. They were not adequately prepared. And Gabriel made the point that even going through H5N1 and avian influenza, which was a severe stress test for Hong Kong, really in terms of SARS, they were not adequately prepared. But I think they made the second major point is that in going through their crises, each of those countries have come out stronger. They have somehow gotten better, and they've improved in a variety of different ways. But I think the third point which came through from that discussion is that the state of preparedness is in many ways relatively fragile. It's not really something that you achieve, but it's more or less a continual process of renewal, but there are specifics related to each country. It is not a cookie-cutter process. And so I think those are some of the points that I took home. In the second panel, which was moderated by Jackie Katz and which involved Wenqing Zheng, Karen Midtun, Clement Lewin, Bruce Jellin, and Steve Solomon, that panel focused on the full spectrum of considerations related to vaccines, again, based on the 2009 pandemic influenza experience. That discussion was also extremely important in pointing out some of the fundamentals. One, we saw a couple of graphs during a couple of talks, and it showed that clearly that vaccine was not available. It did not keep up with the spread of disease. It was not available as quickly as wanted. A second major point was that it was not seen as business as usual by industry. It was really seen as an extraordinary event to which they wanted to contribute. A third point, which I think was very clear, is that the overall process of addressing vaccines is not uniform. There were aspects related to that train of processes which worked really well. And again, I think the parts that worked really well, in essence, were an intensification of what is done on a regular basis. Those parts went relatively well. It was the parts where that were ad hoc, which turned out to be much more difficult. So there are regulatory aspects, particularly in countries which did not have regulatory mechanisms. There are issues such as legal aspects and liability. There were operational aspects. How ready were countries ready to receive vaccine? There are bureaucratic and administrative processes which involved how do you certify that things are in place and so on. These, in the end, turned out to be relatively ad hoc as we went through, and they were difficult. And they were slower than we would want. One of the points that Wenqing pointed out is that, in a sense, we dodged a bullet in 2009. The occurrence of the first cases and the cycle of seasonal vaccine happened to conspire with each other so that, in essence, we did not have to make a decision about when to ask manufacturers to stop making seasonal vaccine and switch over to pandemic vaccine. Ever since 2009, and actually before that, this issue about who is going to make that call has been something which has been asked repeatedly and really not answered, because I think that, in essence, nobody really wants to make that decision. But it is something which is in front of us. One of the questions what was asked is what would have happened if the pandemic had been more severe? And again, I think that there's a sort of bright side and a dark side to the answer to that. In essence, certain decisions would have been easier. It would have been, if we have a severe pandemic, just go ahead. This is a point articulated by Wenqing again. But I think the flip side of it is that if we are in a severe pandemic, will vaccine be released by countries in which vaccine is being manufactured? And I think that that is an unanswerable question, but it is something that we all should be concerned about. Now, the third panel, which I moderated and which included Ambassador Makram Wibisono, Ambassador John Lang, Ann Hufos, and Steve Solomon, focused on the pandemic influenza preparedness framework, but really as a discussion on the importance of equity and fairness and not addressing these issues if we're going to go forward. And I think it was an extremely interesting both historical discussion but also backdrop to understand how are some of these decisions made about frameworks and how do they evolve. But in essence, we heard Ambassador Wibisono describe that from the Indonesian perspective, why is it that they made the decision to withhold viruses? And to summarize it very succinctly, I think, is that the Indonesian perspective was that we are being impacted by this infection. We have a novel infection, and we have people who are dying from it and who are infected by it. We are cooperating with the world by providing viruses. We understand the need for surveillance, and we are providing those viruses. But we also need countermeasures, and we cannot obtain them. And this is not acceptable. This is not a fair situation in the world. We heard from Ambassador Lang the perspective of the United States, but also, I think, a number of other countries, which is that, in essence, these kinds of emerging viruses, these events threaten the entire world. There is a responsibility to provide this information. There is a need for global surveillance. A number of years have now passed since that series of negotiations and discussions took place, and the PIP framework, I think, with the passage of time, in many respects can be seen as a somewhat difficult negotiation, which led to a mechanism which placed viruses and benefits on quote-unquote equal footing. That was the breakthrough concept which allowed everything to come into focus. Now, the reason why the PIP framework is unusual, if not unique, is that it is something which does not just state principle. We have many documents, we have many meetings which say these things are important. But what the PIP framework did was go beyond stating the principle and actually acting upon it. And that's what makes it unique. That's why I think for so many people, the PIP framework remains a kind of touchstone about what we should be aspiring to. It actually walks the talk. So I think that it's fair to say, and I think we'll come back to this point maybe later, I think that the future of multilateral global cooperation related to pandemics, but very much so for all other issues, and this could be antimicrobial resistance, this could be any number of global health issues which are in front of us, really depend upon getting that balance right. There is a global collective perspective, there is a fairness equity perspective, and getting that balance right is really the work of modern politics and public health at the global level related to these sorts of issues. But in discussing the PIP framework, what is also clear is that time does not stand still. It was nice to achieve that framework, but we are now in a situation in which other frameworks have developed. We talked about the Convention on Biological Diversity and then the development of the Nagoya Protocol. And the development of that protocol and its implementation has created a situation. So we now know that there are instances where seasonal influenza viruses are not moving in the way that we want them to move. And so this is early at the beginning, but the actual impact of having two frameworks of whose relationship is not that clear is having an impact on the day-to-day concrete work of getting ready for seasonal influenza. The second issue which has come up is that because of the development of science and technology, it's possible that genetic sequences will replace viruses, if not now, in the near future. And if that occurs, it is also very clear that it has the potential to erode the implementation of the PIP framework, because one of the foundations is, again, virus and benefits sharing. Genetic sequences are related, but they are a different thing when you come to framework and to these kinds of concepts. And so this issue is very much on the mind of countries and on WHO, and so it has been explored, I think, through different committees over the past few years, and it will come up at the World Health Assembly in 2019 for discussion, and we will see how the countries decide to take this forward. But in essence, everyone, if the PIP framework is lost, it is going to be a gigantic step backwards, because the actual implementation of that has led to the availability of vaccines, of antivirals. It has resulted in the availability of some funding on a continuous basis, both to develop structures in countries to support surveillance and other public health necessities. However, if the PIP is going to go forward, it's clear that it's going to require more lengthy negotiations, and whether that means a full-blown discussion instead of negotiations as was done to actually develop the PIP is not clear, or whether there can be some alternative process. But whatever it is, it was going to take a lot of effort on the part of a lot of people and countries. So with that, I think it helps set up the discussions today. So we're going to begin the morning with panel number 4. And the essential goal for that panel discussion is to explore whether we can get off what I've often called the roller coaster and move from having episodic attention and episodic funding and support for preparedness to something which is on a more sustained and regular basis. I think that all of us probably hope that we don't need to go through a crisis to make progress each time. This is not really a great way to make progress. So that discussion will be led by Kumanan Rasanathan, and so we will move over to that in a few moments. But then after that panel discussion, we will then follow it up with small group discussions. And again, that will, in essence, continue the discussions of the panel, which is really how can we position preparedness so it is not considered extraordinary work, but it's really considered expected work. And then after lunch, we will get to hear the reflections and what is, how four very thoughtful and knowledgeable individuals envision for the future, how we go forward from all of these things. So, Ceci, do we have any other points to raise this morning before we get started? Okay. Kumanan?
Maybe